In the heart of Westwood, Alabama, secrets festered beneath the surface of a godly home. Reverend Isaiah Walker, revered by his congregation, was about to confront a darkness that no sermon could cast out. His wife's illicit affair with a 19-year-old boy would ignite a deadly chain of events. On a cold February night, blood would spill, and the perfect image of the Walker family would shatter into an irreparable mess. What unfolded was a nightmare no prayer could silence, and a murder that no faith could forgive. In Westwood, Alabama, the sprawling Greater Faith Baptist Church was more than just a place of worship. It was a cornerstone of the community. Every Sunday, the pews were filled with families who looked to Reverend Isaiah Walker for guidance. Isaiah, a tall, commanding figure, led the congregation with powerful sermons that resonated deeply with everyone who heard them. He was 46, but the years of shepherding his flock had given him wisdom beyond his age, a trait that only increased the respect the community had for him. At his side was Ruth Walker, his wife of over 20 years. Ruth had always been known as the quiet strength behind Isaiah, a woman who had dedicated her life to supporting her husband's ministry. She was elegant, graceful in her every movement, yet there was a tiredness behind her eyes that few noticed. The weight of being a pastor's wife had taken its toll on Ruth over the years. Though they appeared to be the perfect couple, something was missing between them. Isaiah had thrown himself deeper into his work, his ministry becoming his sole focus. The long hours he spent at church, counseling others, preparing sermons, and leading community events, left little time for Ruth. Their marriage had grown distant, their conversations reduced to church matters and family logistics. By 2011, Ruth was feeling more isolated than ever. The loneliness crept into her soul, and no amount of prayer seemed to ease the emptiness she felt. During this time, Ruth began noticing Terrell Anderson, the 19-year-old son of Pastor Anderson from St. Luke's AME, another church nearby. Terrell was young, vibrant, and full of life, everything Ruth hadn't felt in years. He was athletic, with broad shoulders and a charming smile that caught the attention of many. But it wasn't just his looks that drew Ruth in. Terrell had a presence about him, a confidence that reminded Ruth of what Isaiah used to have when they first married. Terrell had been dating Ruth and Isaiah's eldest daughter, Monique, for a few months. Monique, who was 21, was headstrong and focused, deeply involved in the church just like her parents. She adored Terrell, often talking about their future plans together. However, Ruth began to feel something she couldn't explain whenever she saw Terrell. It started with small glances at church events, moments when their eyes would meet across the room. There was a tension that lingered in the air between them, something unspoken but undeniable. By early 2012, things between Ruth and Terrell had crossed an invisible line. Ruth, who had spent years feeling emotionally neglected, found herself seeking out Terrell's attention more frequently. He began visiting the Walker house under the guise of seeing Monique, but in reality, his visits were often to catch glimpses of Ruth. Ruth, in turn, found excuses to be around whenever Terrell was there. They would talk, though never about anything substantial, small conversations about church, community events, or family life. Yet, beneath the surface of these simple exchanges, there was a deeper connection forming, something forbidden but impossible to ignore. As the months passed, their interactions became more frequent. In the summer of 2012, what had been just stolen glances and subtle exchanges at church functions turned into secret meetings. These encounters were filled with intensity and excitement, a dangerous thrill that Ruth hadn't felt in years. Terrell, despite his youth, gave Ruth the attention and affection she had been craving. Their relationship quickly spiraled into an affair, one that neither could stop, even though they both knew the consequences would be devastating. By September 2012, Ruth was fully engrossed in the affair. She would sneak away from church events to meet Terrell, often lying to Isaiah about where she was going. The weight of the deception began to build, but Ruth couldn't bring herself to stop. For the first time in years, she felt alive, desired, and important. She knew it was wrong, knew the affair was a betrayal of her marriage, her faith, and her family. Yet, the loneliness she had lived with for so long made it easy to justify her actions, at least to herself. Terrell, for his part, was equally conflicted. He had always respected Reverend Walker and admired the Walker family. Being with Ruth was dangerous, and the guilt of betraying Monique gnawed at him. But the pull of the affair was too strong. It gave him a sense of power, something he hadn't felt before. His relationship with Monique began to suffer as a result, though he tried to hide it. The tension between the two grew, but Monique, focused on her studies and church work, didn't suspect the real reason behind Terrell's distance. As the year wore on, the affair grew more reckless. By December 2012, Ruth and Terrell were meeting in secret at least once a week. They would find secluded spots in town, places where no one would recognize them. The affair was a delicate balance of desire and fear. Both knew that if Isaiah found out, the consequences would be catastrophic, but neither could stop. It was an addiction, a dangerous game they were playing, and neither was ready to face the end of it. By early 2013, the tension had reached a boiling point. Isaiah had begun to notice the distance between him and Ruth. She was more withdrawn, often avoiding conversations with him. He suspected something was wrong but couldn't put his finger on it. His dedication to the church left little room for investigating further, and he chose to believe that Ruth was simply stressed or overwhelmed. But the truth was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. In February 2013, Terrell sent Ruth a message, asking her to meet him at an abandoned shack on the edge of town. They had used the shack as a meeting spot before, but this time felt different. Ruth hesitated but agreed to go, unaware that Isaiah's suspicions had finally taken root. What would unfold that night would shatter their lives and the community forever. The secret they had both worked so hard to hide was about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. On February 23rd, Terrell's body was found by a group of teenagers who had wandered into the shack. The police were called, and the investigation was launched. Detective Marcus Johnson, a seasoned investigator, arrived on the scene. Johnson had worked many cases in the area, but this one felt different. The brutal nature of the crime suggested a crime of passion, but there were no immediate suspects. The tragedy happened on the night of February 22nd, 2013. It was cold and still. Ruth sat in her car, her hands trembling as she read the message from Terrell. He wanted to meet her at the old shack on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the first time they had met there, but something about this night felt different. Ruth hesitated, her heart racing with both anticipation and fear. The affair had been spiraling out of control for months, and she knew deep down that it couldn't last much longer. Still, she agreed to meet him. As she drove through the darkened streets, the weight of her actions began to sink in. She had been living two lives, sneaking around behind her husband's back, risking everything. The guilt gnawed at her, but the thrill, the attention, the connection with Terrell had filled a void that had existed for years. Isaiah had been distant, absorbed in his work, leaving Ruth to feel like nothing more than a shadow in their marriage. Terrell had given her the affection she craved, but now, as she neared the shack, the reality of her choices pressed down on her like a heavy weight. What Ruth didn't know was that Isaiah had begun to suspect something. Over the past few weeks, Isaiah had noticed subtle changes in Ruth's behavior. Her absences, her nervousness, the way she avoided certain conversations. He hadn't said anything, choosing instead to observe quietly, piecing together the signs. That evening, he had followed her, watching from a distance as she parked her car near the shack. Isaiah's suspicions were confirmed, but the sight of Ruth and Terrell together ignited something dark inside him. As Ruth entered the shack, the air was tense. She and Terrell exchanged quiet words, talking about the future, about the secrets they shared. Ruth could feel Terrell's impatience, his desire for something more permanent between them. She listened, knowing that the tangled web of lies they had created was slowly tightening around them both. They embraced, seeking comfort in each other, unaware that Isaiah was lurking just outside, watching everything. When Isaiah saw them, it was as though something snapped inside him. His heart pounded in his chest, his vision blurred with rage. Years of betrayal and neglect, years of sacrificing for his ministry, only to see this, his wife in the arms of another man, and a much younger one at that. Without thinking, Isaiah burst through the door. What followed was chaos. The room exploded with the sound of shouting, accusations flying as Isaiah confronted Ruth and Terrell. The intensity of the moment overwhelmed them all, but it was Isaiah who lost control. His eyes landed on a crowbar lying nearby, and in a blind fit of jealousy and betrayal, he grabbed it. He barely registered what he was doing as he swung the blunt object, striking Terrell across the head. The blow was brutal. Terrell crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from the wound, staining the old wooden boards of the shack. Ruth's scream pierced the night air, but Isaiah was already gone, fleeing into the darkness. The once powerful pastor, the man so many had looked up to, had just become a murderer. As he disappeared into the night, the weight of what he had done hadn't yet settled in. He ran, not fully understanding the gravity of his actions, only knowing that his world had been torn apart in a matter of moments. The next morning, February 23, 2013, was like any other in the small town of Westwood. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. A group of teenagers, bored and looking for a place to hang out, stumbled upon the old shack. They were laughing, talking about school and weekend plans, unaware of the horror that awaited them inside. As they entered the shack, the smell of blood hit them first. The laughter stopped. Their eyes fell on Terrell's lifeless body, crumpled on the floor in a pool of dried blood. The teenagers stood frozen, their minds struggling to process the gruesome scene before them. Panic set in, and one of them managed to dial 911, their hands shaking as they gave the dispatcher the address. Within minutes, the Westwood police were on the scene. Detective Marcus Johnson, a veteran investigator, arrived shortly after. Johnson had worked in law enforcement for over 20 years, and he had seen his share of violent crimes. But something about this one felt different. The brutality of the attack suggested a crime of passion, not some random act of violence. As Johnson surveyed the scene, he noticed the signs of struggle: the overturned chair, the splintered wood where the crowbar had struck. Terrell's body lay in an unnatural position, his head twisted at an odd angle, blood pooled around him. It was clear that this wasn't just a fight. This was a murder driven by emotion, possibly jealousy. Johnson knew he had his work cut out for him. Back in the community, news of Terrell's death spread quickly. People were in shock. Terrell was well loved, known for his kindness and dedication to the church. His father, Pastor Reginald Anderson, was devastated. The Anderson family had always been pillars of the community, and now they were faced with an unimaginable loss. For 2 weeks, the investigation into Terrell's murder seemed to stall. Detective Johnson and his team interviewed neighbors, family members, and churchgoers, but no one seemed to know anything. Then, on March 6, 2013, things began to shift. Witnesses came forward, reporting that they had seen Ruth leaving her home late on the night of February 22nd. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. As the police dug deeper, they uncovered Ruth's affair with Terrell. The community was rocked by the revelation. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the whispers about what might have driven someone to kill Terrell grew louder. It wasn't long before Ruth became the prime suspect. The police brought Ruth in for questioning. She sat across from Detective Johnson, her usually calm demeanor shattered. She was visibly shaken, tears streaming down her face as she recounted the events leading up to Terrell's death. She admitted to the affair, explaining how it had started and how it had spiraled out of control. But when asked about the murder, she denied any involvement. She claimed she had no idea who had killed Terrell, but her confession put her squarely in the middle of the investigation. Meanwhile, by March 8, 2013, Isaiah's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He had stopped giving sermons, retreating into the house and avoiding the congregation. The man who had once been the spiritual leader of the community now seemed like a shell of his former self. His congregation began to whisper, wondering what had happened to the pastor they had always admired. Isaiah's guilt weighed heavily on him. He avoided the police, convinced he could hide what he had done. But the pressure was mounting. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Terrell's lifeless body. He could hear Ruth's scream echoing in his mind. His dark thoughts consumed him. How much longer could he keep the secret? What would happen when the truth finally came out? Isaiah knew the walls were closing in, and the weight of the crime he had committed was becoming too much to bear. The early morning of March 20th, 2013, was thick with tension in Westwood. The sun had barely risen when police cars pulled up quietly in front of Isaiah Walker's home. Inside, the house was silent, with an eerie stillness that mirrored the state of Isaiah's mind. He hadn't slept, and he hadn't prayed in weeks. The man who once stood tall as a spiritual leader in the community was now haunted by his actions, and the weight of the murder pressed heavily on him. His once dignified posture was gone, his eyes hollow, and his skin pale from lack of rest and the crushing burden of guilt. Detective Marcus Johnson had been methodically piecing together the events leading to Terrell Anderson's death for nearly a month. The evidence had slowly mounted, and with Ruth's confession, everything had fallen into place. Ruth's admission had been heartbreaking. Her sleepless nights finally drove her to reveal the truth. She told the police how Isaiah had followed her that night, how he had lost control, and how Terrell had been brutally struck down. Her words painted a vivid picture of that fatal night, one Isaiah had tried to suppress from his mind. The police entered the house cautiously, as if the walls themselves held the weight of what had happened. Isaiah sat in his study, surrounded by books and papers, but his eyes were vacant, staring at nothing. He knew they were coming, but he didn't move. When the officers approached, he offered no resistance, his silence louder than any words. The man who had once commanded rooms with his sermons now couldn't muster the strength to defend himself. As Isaiah was escorted out of his home, the gravity of his actions finally seemed to settle over him. The streets of Westwood were still mostly quiet at that hour, but the few neighbors who were awake watched from their windows, their hearts heavy with disbelief. This was the man who had led them in prayer, who had baptized their children, who had been there in their darkest moments. And now, he was being led away in handcuffs. His fall from grace was complete, and the community was left to grapple with the reality that their pastor had committed a terrible crime. By April 15th, 2013, the trial of Reverend Isaiah Walker was the talk of the entire town. The courtroom was packed with members of the community, many of whom had once been devoted followers of Isaiah's ministry. Now, they sat with anxious faces, unsure of how to reconcile the man they had admired with the crime he had committed. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, filled with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and sadness. The prosecution didn't waste time. They laid out the events clearly. Isaiah had discovered Ruth's affair with Terrell Anderson, followed her on the night of February 22nd, and in a moment of uncontrollable anger, killed Terrell in a violent outburst. The evidence was undeniable: Ruth's testimony, the affair, and Isaiah's growing suspicion. Ruth's confession had been detailed, explaining how Isaiah's discovery of the betrayal had pushed him over the edge, transforming him into a man who no longer recognized himself. Isaiah's defense attorney attempted to present a different picture, trying to frame Isaiah as a victim of emotional manipulation. The argument was that the affair had driven Isaiah to his breaking point, that he had been pushed too far by the betrayal of his wife and the young man who had stolen her affections. But the courtroom could feel the weight of the evidence, and it was clear that no matter how Isaiah's attorney tried to spin it, the facts couldn't be ignored. Ruth's testimony was particularly painful. She stood before the courtroom, her face pale, eyes swollen from the weeks of stress and guilt. She recounted the affair in a detached way, explaining how it had started and spiraled out of control. She described how Isaiah had followed her that night, and how, in a moment of rage, everything had collapsed into violence. As she spoke, the emotional connection between Ruth, Terrell, and Isaiah became painfully clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just a story of a murder. It was the unraveling of a family, of trust, and of the image Isaiah had built for himself. The community was torn. Many couldn't believe that Isaiah, a man who had been a guiding light for so long, could have fallen so far. Others felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just by the man who had killed, but by the realization that their lives had been influenced by someone who could harbor such darkness. The tension in the room was thick, and it became clear that the affair had not only destroyed Isaiah's family, but had also deeply impacted the very fabric of the community. By April 28, 2013, the trial had come to an end, and the jury's deliberation was short. The evidence was overwhelming, and the emotions in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict for second-degree murder, there was a collective breath held by everyone in the room. Isaiah sat silently, his face devoid of any emotion. He had known this was coming. The life he had built was now in shambles, and the man who had once stood as a moral leader was now convicted of a brutal crime. The sentence was handed down: life in prison. The courtroom was filled with whispers, people trying to process what had just happened. Isaiah's proud legacy was in ruins. The congregation that had once looked to him for guidance was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered faith. Many members of the church couldn't reconcile the man who had preached about forgiveness, love, and redemption with the man who killed in a moment of fury. As Isaiah was led out of the courtroom, the faces of his former congregation stared back at him, filled with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. The fall of their pastor left them questioning everything they had believed in. For years, Isaiah had been the person they turned to in times of crisis, and now he was the source of their deepest disappointment. After the trial, Ruth left Westwood, unable to face the judgment of the community. The once thriving church was now leaderless, and many members stopped attending services altogether. The death of Terrell and the scandal surrounding his affair with Ruth had left scars that would never heal. Detective Johnson, reflecting on the case, knew that this was not just a story of a murder, but a tragedy that had destroyed lives and left an entire community questioning its faith. And it boils down to the fact that cases like this are extremely annoying, like the case where the mom's affair with her son's girlfriend ends deadly. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates.